From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Our focus this week is on China and the restrictions it places on the media inside the country, and how it affects not only coverage inside mainland China, but also how other news outlets cover the country. Now, for those who aren't familiar, China has something that's become popularly known as the Great Firewall. This blocks access to websites like Facebook, Google, and the New York Times. Foreign reporters working in China have also encountered something of a great bureaucratic wall, where reporters are punished for reporting on sensitive topics and can be harassed by security officials or lose their visas to stay in China. Still, despite these restrictions, media in China is much freer today than it was a couple decades ago. Today we'll look at how China's media policies in the past have shaped how events are covered today and how today's policies will affect future reporting. Joining me in studio is Liao Jibo. He's the Deputy Director of China Radio International's English Service and currently a visiting scholar at the University of Missouri. From Beijing, Felicia Sonmez, a China correspondent for Agence France-Presse and a member of the Board of Directors of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China. Previously, she was a national political reporter for the Washington Post. And from Hong Kong, William Ni, a China researcher at Amnesty International. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Welcome to Global Journalist. William Ni, I want to start with you. If you could just give us sort of a broad view of how the internet looks and works in China. How is that different from how it works and feels in the United States or Canada or South Africa or other places in the world?
Well, I think in many ways it might feel very similar. And I think one thing to point out at the beginning is that the internet is really changing China, and that it's a very, very dynamic place in many ways, and people are able to share and express opinions that was impossible just 5 or 10 years ago, even with all the restrictions. And Weibo, which is kind of a mixture of Twitter and Facebook, has helped change things. WeChat and other platforms are changing things dramatically. With that said, they do have the Great Firewall, which is largely to keep Chinese internet users from accessing many of the websites that the government doesn't like, such as the New York Times or the BBC, or Gmail is just added to that, and Google services. So there's that level. But another important level is that at the company level, the companies like Sina Weibo employ many people who delete things, and people also engage in a degree of self-censorship because they know what things might be deleted and what aren't deleted. But overall, the internet is just changing China dramatically and having many positive benefits. But because of that, what we've seen, especially since Xi Jinping has come to power in the last 2 years, is that there are more and more ideological restrictions on the internet, restrictions in movies and in academia, and it seems like there's an across-the-board tightening. So that's just kind of the general picture as we see it at Amnesty.
Liao Jibo, I wanted to get your response to that as well, and if you could give us some perspective, why does the Chinese government say that it places these restrictions on the internet? What is their rationale?
Well, I think the Chinese government just want to regulate. I mean, regulate may be a more proper word for them. And they think it's a common practice to regulate and even to monitor the internet. Well, the U.S. government is monitoring the internet, and even more extensively, actually. Look at the Edward Snowden case. And it's not only monitoring inside America, but outside America. Last month, President Obama said the U.S. government is going to build a digital communication hub in the Middle East to monitor these extremist voices, as he said. Well, for the Chinese government, I think it's understandable that they also want to do the same. So the question is not whether or not the government should do it. It's rather how it can do it. Blocking is not a very smart way. Well,
so blocking the websites, you're saying, is not a very smart way for regulating the internet?
It's not a very smart way for blocking a handful of websites. It's definitely not the best way. But the problem is, in China we have like 650 million users, internet users. That's half of the population. and that's double the population here in America. So it's really difficult for the Chinese government to regulate the internet and to monitor it. It lacks the technical, financial, and even human resources to do that. So what they can do, I think, well, they think maybe the best way is to cut off these websites that they think may be causing some troubles.
Felicia, Sonmez, I want to bring you into the discussion as well. You heard Liao Jibo just speaking of the Chinese internet restrictions and comparing them to the NSA's surveillance of the internet here. What do you make of that? What's your perspective?
Well, thanks very much for having me on. I think from the perspective of state media, that's a line, and from Beijing here, that's a line that we often hear when it comes to these internet restrictions. But I do think there's really two issues at play. One is online censorship, and another is the broader issue of press freedom here. On the latter one, you can just simply look at the numbers, and a recent Reporters Without Borders survey ranked China 176th among 180 countries when it comes to press freedom, and the U.S. ranked 49th, while still not at the top of the list, certainly still a pretty big difference there. And in terms of the restrictions on how reporters are able to do our jobs here, certainly there's been a tightening, as William mentioned, over the past 2 years or so, and I can go into a little more detail on that. When it comes to online censorship, though, I think it's a real fascinating issue. It's one that is constantly changing here, and it's sort of a moving target. We're all trying to do our jobs in the best way that we can, and that usually means adapting to these changes, whether it's through, in the case of a lot of foreign journalists here and domestic journalists, trying to use VPNs, virtual private networks, in order to try to scale the Great Firewall.
These are sort of like ladders that you can use to get over the Great Firewall to get to websites on the other side. Is that a fair analogy? Okay.
Right. And those have been successful in the past, but there's been a greater effort by the government here to try to crack down on them. And as a result, you're seeing a lot of the providers that were very reliable in the past now suddenly not working. And that, combined with just a whole lot of other frustrations on the online censorship line, has added to a lot of difficulty, both for journalists here as well as for businesses. The American Chamber and the European Chamber here in Beijing released surveys in the past month, and both of them cited about half of their members as being increasingly frustrated with the internet restrictions in Beijing.
Liao Jibo, I wanted to ask you, your job as a journalist in China, your job is to get information from wherever you can get it. Talk to me about how the internet restrictions there, how do they affect your day-to-day work? How do you circumvent them?
Well, it actually doesn't cause that much trouble to me or to Chinese journalists as it may do to foreign journalists, because only a handful of websites are blocked, and these websites we Chinese don't use them so often anyway. Well, I can understand the inconvenience to foreigners living in China, either foreign journalists or other organizations. They have to use VPNs. We Chinese have a saying for that. It's 翻墙 in Chinese, literally meaning cross the wall. But you can use that, and you can access all the blocked websites. Do they get punished or prosecuted for using these? Or they don't.
Okay, so if you can make it over the wall, you're fine.
Yeah, that's why everybody is using it, Chinese and foreigners. But the problem is, if you use VPN, it makes the connection slow. And it also costs like $100 a year. So if you want to use the VPN to watch video, that may be a little bit difficult. Well, for me, I usually use Chinese social media, basically Weibo and WeChat, as William said. But I also suffer from the blocking because I have lost some contacts with some of my foreign friends. So that's a problem.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we're looking at the restrictions China has placed on the internet and journalists, and how it's affecting coverage from not only inside the nation, but how foreign correspondents are covering the country as well. Joining me this week in studio is Liao Jibo, Deputy Director of China Radio International's English Service, and currently a visiting scholar at the University of Missouri. I'm also joined by Felicia Sonmez in Beijing. She's a China correspondent for Agence France-Presse and a member of the Board of Directors of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China. And from Hong Kong, William Ni, a researcher at Amnesty International. If you're interested in more global journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at globaljourn. William Ni, I want to turn the discussion now to sort of how journalists do their job and what restrictions they face within China. What do we know about what restrictions Chinese journalists face working within China and what restrictions international journalists face?
Well, I think Chinese journalists, many of them are doing a great job in trying to report on human rights stories. I think a lot of times if they run into restrictions, it could be that they file a story and certain sections get cut, or perhaps the story doesn't make it at all. And another important point to mention is that in the editing process, the editors have a lot of discretion at newspapers for finding which stories to take up and which not to. And when sensitive news breaks, like, for example, if there were some huge political event tomorrow, newspapers might all run the Xinhua, which is the state-run news service. They might run their version of the event and not have, different newspapers throughout China filing their independent reports on the event and giving independent commentaries. So whenever there's important domestic or international news, oftentimes they will try to control the narrative and lead, even if it's negative news, they'll present the negative news and give it kind of the spin that the state wants to present. But I think that there's a lot of journalists who are still doing a very, very important job within China. And one of the worries that actually we have at Amnesty International is that it's increasingly becoming an intranet with all of the restrictions on going abroad. And just last year, China had a conference in Wuzhen, the first annual World Internet Conference, which the main goal really, there are a bunch of internet companies and governance bodies there, but it seemed like the main goal from the Chinese side was to cement the idea of internet sovereignty in the international realm, meaning that every country should have the rights to monitor and regulate their own internet. And I think that across the world, we're seeing greater restrictions on freedom of expression and greater censorship of the internet. So this is kind of a worrying trend.
Liao Jibo, I want to ask you, William brought up the case of what happens when sensitive stories break within China. I want to ask you particularly about the New York Times in China, because there's been a lot of coverage of them. They published a number of investigative pieces about alleged high-level corruption in China involving the then Prime Minister Wen Jiabao. You're a reporter for a state-owned news service. How do you react? How do you know what to do when this type of news breaks, and how do you cover it?
Well, topics related to the top leaders are traditionally sensitive topics that we usually, if you have a story about the personal life, that kind of stories we usually don't do it unless they ask me to, or ask the media to do it. Nowadays, actually, I think we have more reports about their personal life. For example, we have the childhood pictures of Xi Jinping on the internet, and we have many other stories about these top leaders. The so-called sensitive topics are dropping nowadays, as because we have less sensitive topics.
You have fewer
nowadays.
sensitive topics now than previously, you would say, than 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Right, because the internet is changing China. If you say this is sensitive, but everybody is talking about that on the online anyway.
So in other words, because of the internet, you can't ignore the type of allegations that are in the New York Times, even if the New York Times is blocked within China. Then.
Yeah, and people still know it, right? And actually, I think the internet is pretty free nowadays in China. I can give you a very good example. A recent example is a former CCTV investigative reporter, Cai Jin, released a video about the air pollution in China. The video criticized sharply the Chinese government and some companies, organizations for failing to control or to curb the air pollution. Well, they put the video online on YouTube, which is the biggest Chinese video website, in the midnight of last weekend, because they fear that the authorities will order them to,
to take it down. So they put the video on about the pollution
so that
at midnight.
As many people as possible would be able to watch it. And that video went viral everywhere.
And it still exists. It wasn't pulled from the internet. It wasn't blocked.
It's still there.
Well, Felicia, Sonmez, let me bring you in. You heard William Nee talking about a number of the restrictions. The Foreign Correspondents Club of China, which you're a board member of, has released some reports that are critical about the conditions for journalists there. Here we're hearing Liao Jibo say that in some ways there's actually more space for discussion of sensitive issues than there has been in the past. Can you give us your perspective?
Sure. Well, as far as the Foreign Correspondents Club reports go, we just released our annual visa survey a few weeks ago, which basically asks all of our members what their process was like when it comes to apply. Every year, foreign journalists in China have got to reapply for their permission to stay in the country. And whereas in most places this would just be considered, sort of a professional right, that it would be more of a bureaucratic formality. Here in China, it's a very different process, and a lot of times journalists here will have their visa issuance dependent on what topics they covered that year. In many cases, we found that some of our members here were called in for meetings with the foreign ministry to discuss their coverage, especially when it came to issues such as the Western Xinjiang region, where there's been several hundred people killed over the past year, and generally is considered one of the off-limits topics by Beijing, and reporters are the restrictions have tightened so much there that it's virtually impossible to do any kind of significant reporting. So we've seen members have that process abused. As you and Liao Jibo mentioned, the New York Times is still facing a lot of difficulties. In their case, one of their reporters has been waiting 29 months for a visa. He has not been given it, and so he's been forced to report from Hong Kong. In that case, it's quite clear that the government is sort of seeking to punish them for the investigation that they did into the family wealth of Wen Jiabao back in 2012. And I think it's important to note that on an issue like that, the leverage that news organizations have is actually extremely limited. This is really an issue that it ought to be dealt with on the government-to-government level, and the journalists here and news organizations are all trying to do our jobs as best we can, but when it comes to those kinds of sort of diplomatic issues, we don't have a whole lot of leverage. So I guess that's one part of it. As far as whether the internet here is very free, I think there's quite a lot of room for debate on that. Yes, that environmental video did go up recently and got millions of views. On the other hand, the discussion about it was very quickly tamped down on. You had a lot of state media here receiving instructions not to allow for open discussion of it. You're seeing a lot of the social media talk on it as well being cracked down on. In general, pollution is one of the safer issues where there is more space opening up to debate it, but you've got a whole lot of other issues, such as the Hong Kong protests, such as a rights movement here called the New Citizens Movement that became big over the past year and a half. And when it comes to those issues, I think the government censorship has been extremely effective. A lot of the members of that New Citizens Movement who went on trial here in Beijing and elsewhere, the police reacted very swiftly and harshly when it came to cracking down on coverage of those trials. if you asked your average person on the street here if they could name one of the members of those groups or even what those groups are, I would be very surprised if anyone could answer that. So in that respect, I think that censorship's been very effective.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we're looking into China's restrictions on the media and other outlets like Google and Facebook, and what that means for the rest of the world and foreign correspondents covering China. Joining me this week in studio is Liao Jibo. He's the Deputy Director of China Radio International's English service and currently a visiting scholar at the University of Missouri. I'm also joined by Felicia Sonmez in Beijing. She's a China correspondent for Agence France-Presse, and from Hong Kong, William Ni, a researcher at Amnesty International. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues, and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. William Ni, I wanted to ask you, you have been in Hong Kong for some time. You've written about these subjects. There was a large pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong this past September, October. What can you tell us about how that was covered in the media and what types of restrictions Chinese journalists on the mainland and Hong Kong did or didn't face in covering that?
So do you mean restrictions in Hong Kong or in mainland China?
Well, to the extent that there were different restrictions, how did they differ? Because I understand that the journalists in Hong Kong had a lot more liberty to report on that.
Yeah. Well, Hong Kong, as your viewers probably know, is under this one country, two systems. So to a large extent, there's still freedom of expression here, a free press here. Now, people in Hong Kong are very concerned that the free press is eroding and that the number of newspapers that are willing to report independently and boldly are decreasing. There's a lot of editors or owners of newspapers who have very close connections with or business interests in mainland China and are seen by many people as no longer representative of a broad swath of Hong Kong community. But overall, many newspapers that have come under criticism, including the South China Morning Post, I think did a very good job in reporting on the Occupy Central protests. Now, when we talk about mainland China, on the other hand, there we see kind of the dynamic that I was talking about, where most of the time Xinhua led the charge, and most newspapers had to run their version of events. And then another newspaper called Global Times, which is an affiliate to the People's Daily, state-run press, and is very nationalistic in tone, also had some commentary. But I think we also saw what Felicia was describing, where when people on the internet, such as people from the New Citizens Movement or activists, during the Hong Kong protests were sharing photos of the protests or sharing commentary of the protests, many of those people actually were detained. And Amnesty International recorded over 100 people who were detained during the protests. As of right now,
for sharing photos on social media, they were detained.
Yeah, ostensibly, yeah, sharing photos on social media. Now, it could be that in some cases the local police and state security wanted to detain those people for other reasons, that they were activists who were causing trouble, and that sharing the photos was just kind of the trigger. But even right now, 26 are still detained. 9 still have no access to lawyers, which is completely against Chinese law, and 2 have been tortured. So I think what we see here is that, and a Harvard study last year looked at Weibo and showed that it's not so much the content necessarily that gets deleted. It's when there's a call to action or that could be connected with that content. And so I think that's why we saw a lot of detentions surrounding the Hong Kong protests, because the government was very concerned that there could be a spillover effect into the mainland.
Felicia Sonmez, I wanted to ask you, your group has documented various cases of intimidation of reporters. How does that take shape? What has your personal experience been? Do you get the sense that people are listening to your telephone, monitoring your computer, following you on the street?
Sure. I think I've been based here in Beijing since 2013, and that has happened to coincide with this tightening on press freedom here and on this wider crackdown on civil society. And as far as my own personal experience, I've had instances of being followed on the street by plainclothes officers. Whenever any of us go out to cover one of these sensitive trials, there's usually more than 100 uniformed and plainclothes police standing outside the courthouse. Colleagues have had their cameras broken, their USB cards deleted of all of their photos. One colleague here was detained for the better part of a day and actually chained to a sort of metal interrogation chair by the police here. There have been journalists who've been pressured, whose landlords have come under pressure to evict them because of the way that their coverage.
Liao Jibo, I wanted to go to you then. Sounds like we're having some audio problems with Felicia's connections. You heard about some of the difficulties both on the internet and with journalists operating within China. Where do you see things going 5 years from now, 8 years from now? How will things look different?
Well, I'm really sorry to what have happened to the foreign journalists, but I think the situation is improving very positively. Let's say in the past 5 years, we have changed a lot, and I'm sure a lot more is going to be changed in the next 5 to 10 years. The internet is getting more freer, and we can talk a lot more. We can do a lot more actually nowadays. The Chinese government is also changing. I know it's very difficult for journalists to work in China because we don't get the information that should be available. It's very difficult to talk to government officials, and Chinese people are not so willing to talk to the media. So it all makes journalists make it difficult for journalists to work there, to report. But now the government is changing. The central government has asked the government departments to set up spokespersons' offices. And journalism schools in China are helping to train spokespersons. And this is something new in China because in the past we didn't have so many spokespersons. Although it's still pretty difficult to find a spokesperson from a government department.
So
but
reporters
still,
even face difficulties just in finding the right person at the government
that's true.
department that they could talk
Yeah.
to. That's going to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Liao Jibo, Felicia Sonmez, and William Ni for joining us. Global Journalist executive producer is Joshua Kransberg. Our assistant producers this week are Taylor DeHaze, Lucrezia Lotza, Hong Zhao, and Kara McLean. Our studio director is Travis McMillan from RJI, and our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.